GM, everyone. Happy Tuesday, GM. Got a great show with you today. I have my friend Kirk Dameron, who is on to talk about a lot of fun things with us. We're going to get started with Kirk right after this quick break. Kirk GM, how are you?
Hello, good morning, Evan. Good to be talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Kirk. We got a fun show here. We're going to talk about emergent order, Ethereum, generative tech. I'm going to dive into all that, maybe make a couple of visuals. Want to get started with sort of a quick intro to you. And I think for my audience, I don't know, the most interesting part of this was I looked up your ENS, and you registered your ENS 1,232 days ago.
Yes, I did. Is that a long time in your circles?
Well, do you remember what year was that? I mean, do you remember what was kind of going through your life and your mind and the world at that point?
Well, sure. I spend time in the Ethereum ecosphere, have been since late 2015, and as various projects come along and various, essentially, I think of everything as an experiment. So as various experiments and iterations of the tech and applications come on, I select. Don't have time for everything, but I select some subset to pay attention to. And Ethereum, the Ethereum name service was something that looked not only important, but I knew the people who were behind it. I had known them from back with some work we did in 2016. And so it was when I put on my list to I'm an old guy, but I'll use #learn I do a lot of hashtag learning. And that was what I was thinking. And turned out to be a good move because, of course, ENS quite some time later has become one of the premier decentralized apps running on Ethereum, providing a very basic infrastructure service. So that's what I was thinking. It was an experiment. I went down that path, and as I began to learn more about it, I would have, registered my name, registered some other names. Heck, I registered names for my grandkids, and and I registered names for my company, and registered names for a bunch of obscure economists and a few really well-known economists, some of which I still own.
What do you remember? Which wallet you used? Did you use a wallet, or was it a text-based transaction?
I would have done that, I'm pretty sure, through a standard MetaMask transaction using so it would have been a web app that the Ethereum name service exposed. So it would have worked on a web browser, and then if I'm already on a web browser, it's convenient to connect to a MetaMask wallet. So I'm sure I did all those ENS things. I mean, I probably had 30 names at one time, counting my grandkids and these obscure economists and my company, a couple forms of my company, and so on and so forth.
Fun time. What a fun time. Okay, let's start with kind of sort of who you are. Why I invited you on to sort of talk about emergent order and Ethereum. And as I was prepping for this, it struck me that they're really, you having been around in the very early days of Ethereum, plus your academic background as a professor, and what you studied and wrote about for your master's thesis, how that makes you sort of uniquely qualified to opine about what's happening in the world today. So could you kind of give us an intro? What is it about your background that makes now being such an interesting time to be alive?
Well, great. That's a good question. I'm very comfortable with who I am and what season of life I'm in. So I'm now retired from work in blockchain and from tech, but we'll go back and I did an engineering undergrad and a 28-year career kind of in straight tech product development, turning that crank, getting products out that were initially hardware and a little bit of code, and then later a more complex hardware, but a lot of code. And I did that for 28 years through initially a Fortune 10 company, then a Fortune 300 company, then a startup. But in my 40s, kids behind me, kids, in junior high and high school, they are off to a lot of their own pursuits, and I'm going to a lot of games and things, but they don't want to sit around in the evening and talk to dad. So I began to do a lot of reading in my 40s and became just fascinated by the idea of what I read, and the term that was in the literature I was reading at the time. The term was often spontaneous order. I don't think that's the best term today, but that was the term I was reading about. And I got very, very interested and ultimately decided to quit my perfectly fine job when I still had my youngest kid with 2 years to go before he got out of high school, and decided to go to grad school and study economics, not because I wanted to study economics as it's a traditional discipline, or as people traditionally think of it, as about money and finance, which is certainly not how I think of it. But anyway, I decided I wanted to study this concept, these bottom-up social formation. And so that's what I did. And I decided I had been out of school long enough that it would be okay to get a grad degree on the way, but I wasn't really interested in doing anything with that grad degree. I did not plan to teach. So you can ask how I got into teaching later if you're interested. But anyway, did that. And I would say that a lot of the formal jargon that's taught in a graduate economics program, but some of it's interesting and useful. But as you go down that path and learn the basics, I wouldn't say that the main grad school curriculum was the most interesting part, but probably more the part that I went off to on my thesis, which ended up wanting to develop some pretty serious thinking about bottom-up social formation, social self-organization. So I did that, and I wrote that thesis in 2007, and the title is so applicable to my later work in blockchain. It just took me years to figure it out. So blockchain wasn't invented, of course, until Satoshi's white paper in 2008 and the instantiation of Bitcoin in 2009. But I wrote a thesis in 2007, and the title, or really the first half of the title, was self-organizing social behavior occasioned by low-cost communication technology. There's a colon and there's more to the title, but that's the guts of what it was about. And it looked at Internet version 1 and how Internet version 1 enabled an entirely new way for humans to come together. And in the case of my thesis, I looked particularly at citizen journalism as a case study example, and how there was some interesting thing that happened with the formation of, after a certain earth-shaking event, quite severe, killed a lot of people, that there was a virtual news network that kind of stood up overnight and literally in under 36 hours. And for the next 2 to 4 weeks, it kicked the butt of the Wall Street Journal and Der Spiegel and Le Monde and the South China Morning Post and the Los Angeles Times and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, which was kind of an interesting thing. That was what my thesis about. Or you had to have a very special case study and I had to prove to my econ advisor that it was actually an economics thesis when I went in to talk to him and tell him that I wanted to do one on social self-organization. He was going to go, "You're going to have to prove to me that this is good, solid economics." And so I did that, and I wrote a chapter on the history of social self-organization.
Okay, can I hold on? Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, I'm going long on that.
So there was this kind of crisis and the citizen journalist virtual news network. So would you say that became sort of part of the emergent order and disrupted sort of the establishment journalism, or where's the emergent order there?
Yeah, good question. It's basically the citizen journalism in the virtual news network was the very specific example that I had to do. Theses are about doing research. So if I were to give you the second half of the title, it'll make more sense. The second half of the title after the colon, so social self-organizing social behavior occasioned by low-cost communication technology, colon, the Southeast Asian tsunami and earthquake of 2004. So there was a very, very bad earthquake on December 20. 5th of 2004 killed a lot of people in Thailand and Indonesia, and had effects all over the world, clear over to the US in both oceans, the Atlantic, but not killing kind of effects. Anyway, for various reasons, economists are not allowed to do petri dish experiments. That means I'm not allowed to give 100 people one kind of benefit and 100 people another benefit and then go write papers about how the people with the better benefit did better. That's screwing people. It would be unethical. So in economics, we're forced to sometimes find what is called in economics a natural experiment, something that just happens. In this case, the tsunami was the natural experiment, and I was literally looking at bloggers who were writing on things that had nothing to do with tsunamis and earthquakes in the weeks before the earthquake, and then I studied what they did in the weeks after, where they essentially built this amazing news aggregation virtual news network that kicked the butt of the major media for several weeks. And so it's self-organized and it's self-destructed. So that's the example of emergent order. This virtual news network stood up from nothing. You know, an Indian food blogger, I can't remember, another guy was a clothing blogger. They came together and they basically built this thing and did amazing things. So the point is, to turn it into a thesis, you have to have not only the general stuff about social self-organization and about perhaps the history of economic thought, of how philosophers have thought about social self-organization through the centuries, from Aristotle through the Islamic scholars of the 11th and 12th centuries, the Chinese scholars, and so on and so forth, to the Renaissance. You essentially have to not just have all that kind of nice thinking about it. You've got to turn it into something that's real and has data. And so that's how it all came together in the thesis. The thesis had, I think, 5 chapters, and the theory is done in chapter 3, and chapter 4 is really tying it together and using the data on this virtual news network. So it was an example. The citizen journalism, the virtual news network, was simply an example of this broader social self-organization construct that turned me on and rocked my boat. Is that helpful?
Yes. So, okay, so with that background, then you end up finding Ethereum in, you said, late 2015.
Yeah, in late 2015. I wasn't there for the start of Ethereum, but I put my not paying attention to blockchain and not paying attention to Bitcoin. I had heard about it. I had even had students at that time ask me about it, but more from a value point of view, which is not my primary interest. And it had come up in class and whatnot. But in late 2015, I put it together and said, wait a minute, this blockchain thing, especially version 2 blockchains that go beyond what Bitcoin's limited by, were going to be just a profound general purpose tool, giving humans some capabilities they simply didn't have before. And when that happens, profound things are going to happen and come out of it. And I'm fascinated by watching and thinking about that world that emerges. So yeah, late 2015, I put it together, and once that happened, I couldn't unsee it. I see it through the lens of the research I had done 7-8 years earlier. And so as I enter 2016, it's pretty much full time for me, and I'm studying and learning. And of course, there's no books at the time. Everything's just stuff you find online. And I learned about a book that was going to be published in May. And of course, I not only bought it, but I got the Denver Public Library to buy it, and read a few chapters, then bought it. It's still on my Kindle today. That was the first book published that was more general about blockchain, was called Blockchain Revolution. Came out in early 2016, or May of 2016. And it had a lot about Ethereum. It had a lot about competitors to Ethereum. And then the other big decision I made in 2016 was I was asking the question, what blockchain of the version 2 blockchains. So Bitcoin doesn't qualify. It's not a general, it doesn't have a general purpose computing language associated with it. But of the version 2 blockchains that were being talked about then, what was the likely one, or the one most likely to carry the day with the network effect? And it turns out I thought the odds were favoring Ethereum, and that turned out to be a pretty good call. I re-ask myself that question a couple times a year, and here I am in 2023, and I still think Ethereum not only is carrying the network effect, but I still think is most likely to be the one that succeeds in carrying the network effect on version 2 blockchains.
What you have some grandkids? We've talked about this. If one of your grandkids was to ask you what is Ethereum, what would you say to them?
Well, Ethereum's a word that I have grandkids of different ages, from 10 to 2.5. So the 2.5-year-old isn't there yet, and the 10-year-old's really not quite where he's into all middle school thinking, but he's starting to think a lot about science and chemistry. So we'll just say I'm trying to talk my 10-year-old grandson. Ethereum is a name that describes a particular network. And you probably know that a network could be a bunch of people a bunch of machines, or a bunch of stores, or a bunch of roads that come together. And so Ethereum describes a network, but that's only the first of the things it describes. It also describes a protocol. Now, that's a big word for you, Theodore, but I can tell you, you know what a protocol is. You just don't know it by that word. And the example I would use with my grandson would be, imagine that his parents were introducing him to somebody new, and I'd want him to picture me as being that new person that he's being introduced to. And I would say, okay, now Dad just introduced you to me. I'm a new person. What are you doing? And he would be looking at me in the eyes, and he would extend his hand, because he's a guy and I'm a guy. And our hands would clasp, and we would do certain things with our hand. And I would say, all of what we just did is a protocol. And I'll give you an example of how that was a protocol by showing you something where I break the protocol. And so we do it the same example again. You're just being introduced to me. I'm a stranger. You don't know me. And he extends his hand, and he looks at my face, and I look down at the floor this time, and I don't give him my hand right away. And when I do give him my hand, I don't grasp his hand firmly. I give him a fish, and I kind of look sideways, like I'm not interested in him. And I would use that example with my son to say, I just violated the protocol. I violated all the rules about how we as two people should work together. So that's what Ethereum is. And I would use that introducing humans, even for a 10-year-old boy, to understand what a protocol is without getting into computer science. So Ethereum is three things. It's a network, it's a protocol, and it's not the value token, but it has a value token. And it has a value token called Ether. Depending how smart he is, and if he's already watching the news, I might tell him that some of the people on the news networks who are now talking about Ethereum don't know how to call the value token Ether, and they just call the value token Ethereum. And so I said, if you're talking to a person on a major news channel, you might say Ethereum could be a network. It could be about the protocol, the rules for how the different parts of the network work with one another, or it could be referring to the value token itself, because some people use that term. And Ethereum is a network, a protocol, and a value token that essentially creates a set of he doesn't know the word incentives, so I would avoid that, but that creates a set, for your audience, I would say creates a set of incentives. For him, I'd say creates a set of things that are positive and negative, that make it good and not so good for people to do different things. Carrots and sticks, to encourage them to do things and not do things. We could talk about what some of his parents' carrots and sticks are for doing certain things and responsibility he has with respect to his brother and his family. So anyway, that network, that protocol, that value token allows those things to work. And when they work together, and the network does not have a center, this is me telling him the rest of what Ethereum is. When they work where the network cannot have a center, there is no nation state, there is no family of mom and dad, there is no tribal chief or king or queen who control it, but in fact it's very decentralized and lots of different humans control it. When it's decentralized, it allows humans to do some things they've never, ever been able to do before. And that is very profound, Theodore, and we'll be talking about that for a long time, really. But it's going to allow people to do these things they've never done before. And in that sense, it's a little bit like the invention of the printing press, which allowed people to print multiple copies of a document, and it really enabled the industrial revolution, the Renaissance, the religious wars, both good and bad, things that happened 500 years ago. And another example I often give, and I would give to him probably, is it's like the coming of electrical communication. Before we understood electricity 200 years ago, we certainly didn't communicate with electricity. We communicated by people talking in a room to one another, or listening to somebody talk from a platform, or in the town square. Or people could handwrite things or read brochures that were printed. But with electrical communication, we ended up with something called the telegraph. And if he doesn't know what it is, I could explain what the telegraph is. In 1860s, and it really was profound in being able to send messages long distances with humans retransmitting messages. But that's just morphed into radio in the 1910s, essentially broadcast radio, which was the internet of the 1920s, and then TV and whatnot in the mid 20th century, and the internet by the end of the 20th century. Now, each of those electrical communication means were different. For example, the internet was lower cost, ubiquitous, available everywhere, and participative in two-way, in ways that broadcast and broadcast communications of the previous 67 years were not. And so it was profound. Well, in that sense, the internet let us do certain things in the 1900s and 2000s, about the time he's born. Well, early 2010s is when he was born. But it didn't let us do, it did not let us do certain kinds of things, including extend value to one another over the internet. So I would tell him that blockchain, or Ethereum, allows humans to send value digitally, like across a smartphone and across a computer. He's familiar with both of those, in ways that don't require a central government or a central bank or a king or a queen. So I think that's would be my philosophical take for my grandson. We'd spend a little time helping cover any things he's missing, or pieces that he needed to expand on a little bit. He's an inventive guy, and he asks a lot of good questions, and is already pretty interested in chemistry and geology. So I'd be working off chemistry and geology metaphors a little bit with him, I think. But there you go.
Okay, so that was absolutely amazing. I want to highlight one thing and then pause and put it to the side so we can
Sure.
come back to it. But you texted me something like this, but you said, look, Ethereum allows people, or excuse me, where is this? Sorry, it says it allows humans to do things they've never been able to do before. So I'm going to come back to that, because this is very, very crucial. And I think a point that a lot of people just really kind of don't quite understand. But before I get there, I want to zoom in a little bit more on how Ethereum came to be. Is that okay? Can we talk
Sure,
about?
that'd be fine, because yeah, it's part of a path of essentially humans innovating and trying to do something more than the first blockchain was. So yeah, that's good.
Okay.
It won't surprise you to know I have a whole theory on human innovation and what technology really is at its essence, which is perhaps a bit different than some people think. So feel free.
Okay. All right. So tangent here. I want to get into sort of the history of Ethereum. So who's this person?
The person that you're showing up on the screen is Vitalik Buterin. Vitalik is a still young, but now upper 20s year-old man. He's a polymath, quite brilliant, exceptionally brilliant. Vitalik was born in the post-Soviet Union, just a couple years after the Soviet Union devolved. So he was really technically born in Russia. Russia was exerting hegemony, or more than hegemony, over Chechnya, and I believe he was born in Grozny, Chechnya. He immigrated to Canada when his mom and dad immigrated to Canada. Dmitri, his dad's Dmitri or Dima Buterin, and they immigrated when he was 6. Vitalik's an unusual kid, so he's not going to fit all the norms of a young child. He's too brilliant, but he did start. His parents were both involved in computers, and he did have a little old beat up 1980s kind of a computer that he could play on. And he began to take to spreadsheets in a very unique way when he was 3 and 4, and later did other amazing things where he just assimilated lots of facts. I mean, he's got a brain that's, I think, neural divergence would be a would be a term that would adequately describe Vitalik. So Vitalik learns about Bitcoin from his father. Obviously, he's not 6 anymore. When was Bitcoin? 2009. I think he was born in 93. So he's a teenager. He learns about Bitcoin, becomes very interested in it, becomes somewhat expert in it very quickly. And if you have any kids in your broadcast, or some of your listeners have kids, they'll know that a precocious 12-year-old, 14-year-old is often looking for things to do, and they can't exactly get a job. And Vitalik learned about this magazine that was being created called Bitcoin Magazine, and a guy wanted to start publishing articles, and he would pay people in Bitcoin for articles being written. And so Vitalik, a young kid in his, not 15 yet, began to write articles for Bitcoin Magazine, and he got quite a following in doing that, and he became quite knowledgeable. Well, when he finished high school, I could go longer in his biography. His junior high experience kind of sucked. His high school experience, his parents found a really unique school for smart kids and different audience. They taught him some foreign language. I believe he'd learned Latin and other languages in high school, and he was, of course, brilliant in his high school up in Toronto. When he left, he started a little bit of, when he finished high school, he started a little bit of time at University, I believe, of Waterloo up in Canada. And I believe he only stayed about a semester. He didn't stay very long before he told his parents he wanted to travel a little. And he was still writing things about Bitcoin. And he went to different places, Europe and whatever. And I think really since that time, he's been very much a digital nomad. But in that time, after Bitcoin was invented, in 2009 and 10, people began to want to push Bitcoin to do different things. And he was one of those guys who was talking and writing about it. And, they realized the limitations of Bitcoin with its limited scripting language. And so they were beginning to say, well, we could add this layer and make it, maybe make a record of somebody's legal transaction. Or we could add this thing and we could make it like a derivative on the difference of value between 2 points in time of Bitcoin then and Bitcoin now. And this is his metaphor he later used for that. He called it trying to add things to Bitcoin like you add a Swiss Army knife. You can add the corkscrew, you can add the saw, you can add, it's a bad saw, but it's a saw. You can add short knife blades and scissors and all of that, but you end up with a kind of kludgy knife that's not all that convenient. And he worked on a couple of those projects. One of them was called Mastercoin, and one was called Colored Coin in the circa 2013 era. And after he did that, in the middle of 2013, he began to think about, and we're going to get to Ethereum here, he began to conceptualize what Ethereum was going to become. I don't think he knew he was creating Ethereum yet, but he was conceptualizing, well, wait a minute, if we did something else, we could actually make something that's an advanced, not in Bitcoin, but it wouldn't have to look like a Swiss Army knife. And that thing that we could do would be to add a Turing complete programming language. And that's a word worth catching the spelling of, Evan. It's Turing. It's named after Alan Turing, the very, very famous kind of father of computing. 1930s and 40s, did a lot of theoretical work on what is general purpose computing. And in Wikipedia, there's many things on Turing, including...
Okay, hold on. We gotta go back to the 10-year-old here.
10-year-old.
So yeah, and let me kind of reset. Basically what I'm taking from this is Vitalik, brilliant polymath, very interesting life experience. born at an interesting time, right? When he was young enough to be interested in Bitcoin, um, combined with his skills, all that stuff.
Yeah, he's in
And then,
Canada by that time, but yeah, because he's 14, 13, whatever. Yes,
I mean, if he had been born 100 years earlier, he would have had a very different life because
absolutely.
Bitcoin didn't exist.
Right, right. Yeah, in the way that Mozart probably was a polymath, but he did not have at his disposal computers and general purpose computing machines that of course Vitalik had. So all of us are creatures of our historical place in the evolution of human technology. That I would
Okay.
say for sure.
Okay. And so I got this quote from you earlier about how, look, when a network doesn't have a center, it's decentralized, it allows these really interesting things. And, Vitalik, founder of Ethereum, very um, likely, as you said, it's the most interesting kind of, what did you call it, second generation blockchain. Um,
He knew that he understood inherently the limitations of Bitcoin as the first generation blockchain, and he was trying to conceptualize along with others what the future might be. And he came up with this idea of what if we added a general purpose computing language to it, and that is called Turing complete. It would be an adjective or a compound adjective. Turing complete, Turing complete programming language. And so he essentially said, what if we take a blockchain and we add to it a Turing complete computer language,
okay.
programming language?
Okay, fair enough. So, all right. So, for the purposes of what I'm interested in exploring with you right now,
Sure.
is Vitalik as a social leader, more so than a technical leader,
Interesting.
more so than an engineer, a computer scientist. But if I got this visual here, this is sort of the Ten Commandments, and obviously you're not Vitalik, you don't speak for Vitalik,
Of course not.
but what are sort of the important ways? How was he able to found this network that's become this decentralized network that's allowing humans to do things they've never been done before?
Well, I'm just going to brainstorm what he was doing in the 2012s and 13s when I didn't know him, but I know people who knew what he was doing. I'm going to say bullet one could be compelling thinker. Bullet two could be compelling writer. So he developed an audience through those two things, and he's he does have a very strong bent towards, I'm going to call it simple living at low cost, living at reasonable cost. He is not driven by finance. I mean, I can tell you examples from his life. He's not driven by financial considerations the way you see many grifters and scammers come in and try to take advantage of what a permissionless decentralized blockchain like Ethereum can give them. I remember reading about an email he wrote his parents and how he was, on this world thing, and he was going to make some changes. So he was going to get it under just living on, I think, $60, $70 a day, and food and everything, food, lodging, and the whole bit.
I think
So
my favorite post is his blog post about everything he travels with in his backpack.
Now that's quite a bit later. I read that when it came out. I think that's just 2 or 3 years ago, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so that writing and that thinking led him to be I'll call it an idea founder, an idea innovator. So maybe number 4 or 5 is this idea innovator, and he came up with how could we improve it? Like all humans, you can only deal with what you already have, and so Bitcoin was already invented. So this is not about number 5. Bitcoin was already invented, and with Bitcoin, I give a whole talk on this in my Blockchain 101 20-minute thing, but Bitcoin essentially invented the blockchain, the idea of the blockchain. The term was never used in the white paper, and Bitcoin had invented the idea of the crypto economics that can make the incentives work right to maintain a blockchain. And so what he did in his thinking, his idea innovation, was to take those two ideas out of Bitcoin, the blockchain and the crypto economics, and say, well, okay, with that, we don't have to build the Bitcoin network, the Bitcoin protocol, and the Bitcoin token. We can build a different network, a different protocol, a different token. Initially, it didn't have a name, and but we can put into that protocol a general purpose computing language. So now it's can do anything a computer can do. That was to me the profound thing. The idea innovator came out of Ethereum, and it came out in a white paper that he put together in November of 2015. He was struggling with some ideas, and I remember one of the things he was trying to figure out how to keep it from being attacked by a DOS, a denial of service attack, or sometimes we call it a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack. Remember, he was reading computer science. He was now well versed in these kinds of concepts, and he came up with the idea on a run and living in a borrowed house in San Francisco at the time. And then over the next couple of weeks, he put together the draft of the Ethereum white paper in November of 2015. And that the big idea was to take a blockchain, which was now a thing that people kind of understood. We're 5 years in, or was 13, we're 4 years into Bitcoin existing. And we need to come up with crypto economics and put that into the protocol. But we're going to do some things different than Bitcoin. And I would say the two big ideas were this general purpose language on Ethereum. And the other thing was that Ethereum would be dynamic. It would not become as much a product of stasis that was happening at the time, because the Bitcoin, he dealt with a lot of that in 2012, 13, that people who had the, if you will, the power in the decentralized network and protocol of Bitcoin did not want anything to change. They just saw it as this kind of thing to go be money and digital money and nothing more. And he saw it as much more. So number five is he innovated Bitcoin, or he innovated Ethereum. And then he looked up and decided to call it. The name came from him too. He liked the word ether. He looked at what it meant historically and in its ancient roots, and he put it together in that white paper. And innovated or invented. I don't know. I always like innovated, but yeah. Okay.
Hold on. I want to pause on number 4 here, just because it sort of feels silly to think about this, but I really want to zoom in. So like right now, the idea of a programmable blockchain networks where you have relationships that can, interact with other variables as opposed to just sort of static, interactions. That seems just obvious. That seems like clear, like we've been using programming languages for a long, long time. But in 2015, this really was an unusual idea, wasn't it, that Vitalik came up with?
Well, it was unusual, but it was evolutionary, and it was emergent in itself. So he was taking the ideas, major advancement of Satoshi in 2008 white paper. Excuse me for coughing. So a huge innovation had occurred, and I tried to explain that in saying that he clearly took the idea of crypto economics, and he clearly took the idea of a blockchain from Satoshi and from Bitcoin. But he put together a couple of other things. He realized that the general purpose computing language would make it be able to be anything. Just like the internet went way, way, way beyond what anybody could have dreamed in 95. He wasn't trying to innovate the end product or invent the end product. He was trying to invent a system, a protocol, a network that could go on and become something quite different. And to that end, he explicitly talked about its dynamism. It needed to be able to change. We needed to be able to make protocol upgrades, which is a bigger problem than you might think, Evan, because making a protocol upgrade in a decentralized permissionless platform is not exactly simple. And I spent a couple of years of my life making major updates to big IBM computer systems that were running banks and insurance companies. And I'll tell you what, it was months-long processes, and it was centralized and controlled by our corporation structure. And doing that in a decentralized permissionless network is really a profoundly hard thing, but he did have that vision. Knew it would need to upgrade. He knew it would have to be proof of work, for example. I know, Evan, from talking to you, you care about the proof of stake transition that Ethereum made in September of 2022. But that was a 4-year process to get there. It's maybe arguably a longer process, because in the white paper, he articulated a vision for it getting to proof of stake. Turned out to be a lot harder than we thought. Didn't get there in just a couple of years. It took longer to get there. New research, new fundamental research had to happen, and he's been in that as well. He plays a very interesting role. He's stayed true to it and become only stronger as I've watched him over time. I would have perceived him in 2016 and 17 as this young polymath, amazing ideas, isn't it great what he put together? But I wouldn't have pictured him being able to, make that transition from a young adult, a 19-year-old, when they announced Ethereum in 2014 at the Bitcoin conference in January. I wouldn't have pictured him becoming successful as he grew through 19 to 23 and holding, earning, and gaining the respect. Yet he's no centralized guy. He earns respect by his capabilities, by his thinking, by his communication, and by his character. And I think he's a stronger leader today than he was in 2016, 17, when I was having initial conversations with him. In 2017, early 2017, I had the privilege of sitting at dinner with him. I have a picture of that somewhere of 6 of us having dinner in New York, and he was across the table from me. He's an interesting fellow. But I think he's grown quite a bit stronger now.
Can you talk about to your 10-year-old, kind of in that mode, what makes Vitalik a strong leader and someone to admire?
Well, he has some capabilities that he didn't control, and I would certainly talk to my 10-year-old about that. There are things that my 10-year-old may have that are because of the genetics of his parents or his education or whatever, and I'd want him to recognize that's a gift that he didn't get because he's so great. He just has it, and Vitalik has that. But then I would say his character, very honest, very transparent, very that living simply, not trying to aggrandize him stuff, money to himself, not trying. He's not one who thinks that he who dies with the most toys wins. He would be the antithesis of that. He cares about building a system that makes the world better at a broad, emergent social level, not at a level of. So I would try to help my 10-year-old understand that. The kinds of things mom and dad and grandpa and grandma are doing with him that help him not just learn rules and not just color inside the lines, but develop the character to want to live a life that thinks of other people and is somewhat virtuous in ways that we could talk about things that are virtuous and not, and so on. I would say that would be important for my 10-year-old, and I think Vitalik exhibits a number of those.
Would you say he is courageous?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think he even gets. He probably is not affected by social cues in the way that many are. That might be part of. I have a daughter, actually a stepdaughter, but who is autistic, and so I get neurodivergence that are very rational, very in my house level, and. I don't think Vitalik is autistic, but he's clearly part of what we would call neurodivergent. He's not going to be just like every other kid in the middle of the normal distribution. And I think part of that is probably a capability that's a superpower to not really put as much weight into what some of his biggest critics say. And so in that sense, yeah, definitely. That's, by the way, that neurodivergence is my own term. I'm not judging. I'm just describing. I think a lot of us in this world are probably more neurodivergent, but neurodivergence become a term for people who might be Asperger's, might be autistic, but might also just be ADHD. I don't think he's ADHD, by the way, but he's not in the middle of the bell curve, and that includes, I don't think he doesn't take social signals the way a typical, when he was 19, I don't think he did. I didn't know him then, but when he was 21, when I would have met him, let's see, 20, no, I had a little, anyway, 21, 22, and I think he still is quite willing to just be himself. When he writes, for example, he does not kowtow to a particular audience. And so you'll find any paper you read that Vitalik writes, and he writes quite a bit, to often be, I find it brilliant at the front end. And then when he goes into the math, I'm grateful that he has a lot of computer science and brainy people who are going to follow him on that, because I've put my coding spurs, I hung him up in the barn a couple decades ago, and I don't want to go there anymore. So I'm real glad that, but he doesn't, he's not trying to win points and get follows. He just tells it like it is. So anyway, those are the kinds of things I talk to my 10-year-old about. You can't change what your innate capabilities are. You can change how you develop them. And he's done that on multiple margins since his earliest years, from what I can tell from reading a chapter or two about his biography that I've read, and certainly see him doing it now.
Okay, so one more question here, and then I want to go back to this, completing this visual. But one thing I noticed that I really like about Vitalik is he has sort of a playfulness, I think, in his humor and his, embrace of, unicorns and pink and buffacorns.
I watched him yesterday, and he had to pick a gas limit. And as long as the gas limit's above the number it needs, it doesn't matter. And he picked a gas limit, I think it was 69,042. And he said that was because it was meme worthy. He said, right, I was watching him on the podcast. That was for the very first transaction ever made on the Polygon ZK EVM chain yesterday. It's a layer 2 Ethereum chain.
Yep. Okay. So let's see. We've got about another 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. What else? How else can I improve this visual here? I basically want to kind of talk about, how do you build something like Ethereum? How do you build a decentralized network? How do you lead people? How do you, do this? And what are
there's probably some element of constancy and staying the course, whatever words you'd use. I didn't know we were going to be talking about this, but I'm doing this on the fly and happy to be doing it. He has a certain constancy in staying the course. He wants this thing to be better, and he just keeps working it. And if there's research problems, he's indomitable in that he doesn't look at the problems you're having today to be the ones that are going to make him stop.
How about the principle of credible neutrality?
I like that. I think he is a very neutral player. And interesting, I think he earns credibility over time by the fact that he's kind of stood the test of time over these, he's been in the public spotlight really since writing for Bitcoin Magazine, but certainly since 2014 as the founder of Ethereum. So this last decade. Another way of saying it, I just noticed you wrote the word Lindy before I used it, and I was going to say he has become Lindy, normally capital L Lindy, but because it's a concept, but he's become Lindy in that neutrality. That doesn't keep the trolls from coming after him. If you're a Bitcoin maximalist, you'll still make jokes about Vitalik and his master node, and we're really centralized and all that. And I think that's utter hogwash, but that's a separate conversation. So I think in terms
of credible neutrality, as in, like, there are a lot of L2s you talked about, Polygon, ZK, EVM. I mean, does he play favorites, or how is he navigating that within it?
I love it, because I think there's an example in that podcast. They invited him on, and when they invited him on the podcast, he said that he put a framework together, because there's a lot of L2s. There's going to be a lot of layer 2 Ethereums. And he talked about the difference between people saying the right words and committing to the right words. It's too long for this, but he has come up with, it was one of his writings he did in the last, 2 to 5 months, where he came up with a stage 2, stage 1, and stage 0 layer 2 concept. And he acknowledges the trade-offs of why the layer twos are not as decentralized as we'd like right now. And he calls that stage two. They're not there yet. But when they get to at least this level, you could call it a stage one. And when they get to this level, it's kind of code. The code is law, and there's no humans who can break the thing. And so he wants stage zero. He wants the good ones to get there. And I think Polygon ZK EVM got there partly because of its own founders and people who go back as early in the Ethereum community and have shown their own goodness and trustworthiness, but also they're probably the first ZK EVM to get to the stage one, to get out of stage two with too many multi-sigs and too many humans that could break something. And Vitalik happened to define a few months ago a framework, and I think Polygon ZK EVM got there with that credibly stage one. And since I listened to that podcast, or I listened to their live cast yesterday, they're pretty committed in their words. Now, this is words, not action. The action is they got to stage one, and Vitalik's saying, yeah, that's stage one. But they say they think they want to stay in that and should for the year, but kind of move to stage zero next year, which would make me real excited. I got real excited about layer twos initially 2 years ago, and they were calling the summer of, I think, 2021 layer two summer. But I became disappointed when I realized how much the training wheels, the centralization vectors, were still there. And as long as those are there, you're going to get a few $1 billion onto these layer twos, but you're not going to get the trust that Ethereum has without more. And that's that movement to Vitalik's framework. So I think Vitalik doesn't play favorites. I think he looks for people who have the ethos of the ecosystem in mind, and so he cares there. He's going to care. He will have a lower care for your project if it's a grift project. He'll certainly very low care if it's a scammer project. But the grifters who just want to make money off this tech, I think that gives optimism, PBC, a bit of an advantage because they're trying to do a lot of things with public goods formation. Vitalik really cares about public goods and things that are good for the social fabric. Idea we'd talk about Vitalik as much, but this is just all off the top of my head. I've not really written these down or thought that much about them, but fun having this conversation with you, Evan.
Yeah, it did kind of go off on a little tangent.
Very much a first draft on Vitalik, but there's some thoughts there.
Yeah, definitely a first draft, and there's a lot more. I gotta have you back again, Kirk, because I really want to talk about I want to talk to you about Renaissance and sort of other historical periods of this emergent tech. So, like you mentioned, the printing press, kind of blockchain relative to printing press. I really want to explore that. But I also want to kind of refine this, get this down a little bit more, because I really do think that, as you said, like if we go back to the start here, I mean, what is Ethereum? Ethereum is a network of people. And there's really something about, where was this right here? There really is something about the social credibility and the work that I think the Ethereum community has done to have a strong centered fabric, to go through these major protocol upgrades, to have sort of a shared vision that's changed, right, and undergone some tough stuff. And I think there's something just really important that really want to kind of get to the bottom of and dive in deeper with.
I would be happy to chat with you about that as well. I love thinking and thinking out loud, I guess, and philosophizing about some of what we are collectively building here.
Yeah, just the last 5 minutes. Can you tell me about your bufficorn? Right here. What's with the space? I see you have a lot of them that have kind of a space background.
Well, first about NFTs and in general, I sort of skipped real active involvement in the NFT. Well, at least the JPEG graphical NFT version. revolution of 2021. But I have good friends who got in, and I, of course, care about it as one of the use cases that got a whole lot of people very, very interested in the space. People who weren't interested in DeFi, decentralized finance in 2020, became interested through PFPs, and I love that. Some of my friends in other circles who weren't interested in talking about what I did in 2016, 17, 18, and 19 and 20. Now we're all of a sudden, hey, can we go to breakfast? Can we go to coffee and talk about this Ethereum thing? Because they became interested in NFTs. So in my case, I was given some NFTs because somebody considered me an OG. And so I think I ended up with about a half a dozen or more before I ever bought any. And then because Denver was good, I live in Denver, and because I was involved in some of the early talk, heck, I used to go to the Denver Ethereum meetups before ETH Denver existed, and we was talking with a lot of people. I wasn't one of the founders of ETH Denver, but I know those people, and including John Powler, the main driving force. When ETH Denver, in I think their 5th year of doing ETH Denver, had always just put out money, given everybody a free pass. Nobody paid to go to ETH Denver. Ethereum has obviously been good to me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great chapter in my life, both from a work vocational point of view and now a post vocational point of view. And so they were selling these bufficorns. The bufficorn is an icon. It's got the unicorn aspect that's sometimes used in Ethereum, and the bufficorn is kind of a buffalo concept out of Colorado, and they're obviously playful with a lot of the elements. Anyway, they put together an artist, and they came up with something called Bufficorn Biddle Brigade. I don't remember the number, maybe less than 10,000 or about 10,000 unique combinations of these various aspects. And I just realized I had never paid at ETH Denver anything. I had been a speaker a couple of years, and I'd helped be a mentor several years, as I did again this year. And I thought, well, why don't I just buy 5 or 6 of the darn things? Because I'm happy to put that money into ETH Denver's coffers. So I think I had to bid something like 0.1 Ether for them, and I thought I'm happy to put a few dollars into their coffer. So anyway, that's how I got them. The ones I got were random, but since you asked about the space one, and you had it up there a minute ago and seemed to want to go there, I'll just say I've had the benefit of I had a little space flight robotics startup company I helped stand up here in Colorado back in 2011 through 13, and that was when I was active in it operationally. I was then a owner of some equity in it until we eventually sold to somebody else in 2019. So I have interest in space. I've followed the private space flight, in particular the private space flight, not the big government space industrial complex space flight. That's boring to me and very non-innovative. But when you bring in private incentives, you get the innovative stuff. And so I picked this Bufficorn because one of mine had this helmet. And secondly, then when I was working at Consensus from 2016 to till I retired in 2019, I also had the privilege of being asked by Joe Lubin to spend a little time thinking about various people who were talking to him at Consensus about space and blockchain. So I had 5 or 6 different things we talked about and worked on. Actually, different people in the Consensus Mesh did it. I just would get asked to come get involved. And one of those even included, it's a longer story, but it included an acquisition Joe did that has an interesting story where the shortcut was Joe Lubin ended up acquiring, not necessarily was it a good thing, and I didn't even recommend acquiring it all, but nonetheless, he ended up acquiring a very, very interesting private space company that had been well funded when it was founded, and I was just in love with it in 2012, 13, 14, so much so that when I was in Seattle one time, I would have lusted and tried to get a tour and never got it. And here it is, it's 2018, and I'm working for Joe Lubin, and we end up buying that company. So that's a whole nother long story, but I care a lot about space.
Amazing. It seems like you've had 6 or 7 serious careers during your lifetime, Kirk.
Yeah, they aren't all the one thing. That's absolutely true.
Awesome. Well, let's connect offline and get you scheduled to come back. Had a really great time discussing this, and to be continued, Kirk. Thanks again.
All right. Enjoyed it, Evan. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye.